Welcome to the Explainer. Okay, today we're jumping right into a pretty fascinating piece of religious history. We are taking an investigative look into a foundational text of Mormonism known as the Doctrine and Covenants. We're going to break down its history, how it's structured, and its theological standing. And just a quick note up front, everything we're exploring today is drawn directly from a detailed breakdown by gotquestions.org. So whether you are deeply familiar with this faith or you're just hearing about these texts for the first time, we've got some really interesting ground to cover. Let's get right into it. Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for today's explainer. First, we'll contextualize the text within the standard works. Second, we'll map out its history of revisions. Third, we'll examine two major declarations. And finally, we'll break down the source's theological critique. Section 1. The Standard Works, Foundational Texts. So, to truly grasp what the Doctrine and Covenants actually is, we first need to understand where it sits in the broader LDS framework. GotQuestions.org defines it as one of the authoritative standard works of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Meaning, this isn't just supplementary reading, right? This is a highly authoritative foundational text. It sits right up there alongside the Book of Mormon and the Pearl of Great Price to essentially form the absolute bedrock of their doctrine. And this brilliantly illustrates a really important distinction the source brings up regarding how these texts are viewed. When we compare LDS texts like the Doctrine and Covenants against the Bible, there's a fascinating caveat. See, while the LDS texts are considered completely and unconditionally authoritative, the Mormon faith accepts the Bible with one very specific qualification. They accept it so far as it is accurately translated. Now, you might be wondering, what does that caveat actually mean on a day-to-day basis? Well, according to gotquestions.org, in practice, this translates to so far as it agrees with Mormon writings. The source points out that this interpretation essentially makes the Bible secondary to their own later texts whenever a contradiction might pop up. It's an absolutely crucial piece of context for how the Doctrine and Covenants is utilized by the Church. Moving right along, Section 2, A History of Revisions, a Changing Text. This is where the story gets incredibly complex, because we start looking at the surprising fluidity of this text. Originally, as our source outlines, the Doctrine and Covenants was structured in two very distinct steps, or sections. Step 1 was an extensive collection of lessons focused purely on Mormon doctrinal beliefs. Step 2, on the other hand, featured what the text presents as revelations given directly to the prophets of the LDS Church. So it was a very clear two-part document. But here is what's genuinely fascinating about what happened to that original structure over time. GotQuestions.org highlights an intriguing historical pivot. Since the early 20th century, most copies of this book have entirely excluded that first doctrinal section. I mean, think about that. Literally half of the original text, the part expressly dedicated to doctrinal lessons, was just completely dropped from modern editions. And it doesn't stop there. Even the second portion, the Revelations, hasn't remained static. The text has undergone continuous revisions, which include adding entirely new revelations, correcting older ones, and even outright removing previous revelations. GotQuestions.org actually notes that these ongoing changes have caused some pretty significant divisions. You've got different sects of Mormonism basically disagreeing over which specific edition of the text is the truly correct one. All right, let's jump to Section 3, two major declarations, doctrinal shifts. We really need to look closely at a couple of massive historical pivots recorded within this document. But first, let's get our terms straight. What exactly is a declaration? Well, in this context, declarations are not actual word-for-word revelations themselves. Instead, they act more like official statements indicating that the LDS leadership had, in fact, received a particular revelation. Think of them as formal notifications to the Church about a major change in direction. Plotting this out historically reveals some massive doctrinal shifts. Our source singles out two highly notable declarations. Back in 1890, a declaration was added that officially reversed Mormonism's previous endorsement of polygamy. Fast forward to 1978, and a second major declaration removed the longstanding restrictions on non-whites holding the priesthood. As the article points out, needless to say, these were incredibly large-scale changes to the foundational teachings of the Church, and they are documented right here in this text. Which brings us to Section 4. The source's theological critique, gotquestions.org view. Okay, so here we are going to shift our lens a bit to outline the specific theological objections. The article is very direct in asserting that the contents of the Doctrine and Covenants frequently contradict the Bible. It specifically calls out what it views as false doctrines, highlighting teachings such as the idea that God possesses a physical flesh and blood body. It also points to the concept that human beings actually have the potential to become gods themselves, just like God. GotQuestions.org uses these as primary examples of where the text sharply diverges from traditional biblical theology. So, the crucial point is, how does the source tie all of this together? Well, GotQuestions.org concludes with this strong statement. The combination of open changes in doctrine and non-biblical views makes Doctrine and Covenants an invalid source of spiritual truth. This is their definitive theological stance on the document. They're synthesizing both the historical revisions we just discussed and the specific doctrinal conflicts they identified to reach this ultimate conclusion. It really is a fascinating look into how one faith-sacred text is viewed and analyzed through the theological lens of another. And it leaves us with a pretty profound question to think about. How does a living, continually changing text alter the very foundation of a religion? Does it allow for necessary dynamic growth, or does it destabilize its core? It's definitely something to ponder as we wrap up today's explainer. Thank you so much for joining me. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll see you in the next one.